January 10, 1940. A pale winter sun hangs low over the fields near Mechelin-sur-Meuse on the Belgian-German border. The world is locked in uneasy silence. The phony war, they call it. But high above that frost-covered land, the sound of a single Messerschmitt Bf-108 Typhoon cuts through the mist. Inside, two German officers hunch over their maps, Major Erich Hohnmans, the pilot, and Major Helmuth Rheinberger, an intelligence officer carrying a leather briefcase marked Top Secret. Inside it lies the heart of Hitler's next move, the invasion plan for Western Europe, Fall Gelb. But the fog is dense. The compass drifts. A gust pushes them westward. The plane's engine sputters, then coughs out. Below, Belgian farmers pause as the silver aircraft dips dangerously low. Moments later, it crashes into a field of melting snow. Two shaken officers scramble from the wreckage, unaware that their mistake has just handed the Allies a secret so great that it will change the entire course of the war and begin the long road to Hitler's defeat. Europe, January 1940. The war had begun but not yet exploded. For 4 tense months after the invasion of Poland, the Western Front stood silent. Soldiers sat behind fortifications, staring at each other across frozen fields. The press called it the phony war, a strange pause before the storm. Behind this deceptive calm, Adolf Hitler grew impatient. His lightning victories in Poland had convinced him that swift, decisive attacks were the key to conquest. Yet here in the West, he faced the combined might of France, Britain, and Belgium, waiting behind the Maginot Line. Hitler wanted to strike before the Allies could reinforce. He demanded an invasion plan, something bold enough to break the stalemate. That plan was Fall Gelb, or Case Yellow. It called for a massive German assault through Belgium and the Netherlands, sweeping south toward France, the same route the Kaiser's armies had taken in 1914. The idea was simple: bypass the Maginot Line, crush the Low Countries, and encircle the Allied armies before they could retreat. To the German High Command, the plan promised quick victory, but it also carried risk, and secrecy was everything. Hitler's generals understood that if the Allies discovered the plan, the entire operation would collapse. So every officer involved was ordered to protect the invasion documents with their lives. Among those officers was Major Helmuth Rheinberger, a meticulous intelligence specialist from Luftflotte 2, responsible for coordinating air support during the coming offensive. He had been briefed personally on the invasion details, movements, units, and timetables. On January 10th, he was scheduled to fly from Münster in Germany to Cologne for a planning conference. The pilot assigned to him was Major Erich Hohnmans, a seasoned flyer and adjutant to the 7th Air Division. Their aircraft, a Messerschmitt Bf-108 Typhoon, was a fast, single-engine liaison plane, capable but fragile in winter weather. That morning, thick fog covered western Germany. Visibility was almost zero. Several flights had already been canceled due to poor conditions. But Hohnmans, confident in his experience, decided to go ahead. At 10 a.m., the Messerschmitt lifted off the airfield, its silver wings disappearing into the mist. The men carried no radio. On Rheinberger's lap sat the fatal briefcase, filled with invasion orders, situation maps, and tactical timetables for Fall Gelb. Their route should have kept them safely inside Germany's airspace, hugging the Rhine northward. But a few minutes into the flight, disaster began to unfold. A strong northwestern wind pushed them off course. Disoriented by fog, Hohnmans believed he was flying parallel to the Rhine, when, in truth, he was crossing it. By the time he realized his mistake, they were deep over Belgian territory. The engine began to sputter. Icing on the carburetor caused a sudden loss of power. The Messerschmitt shuddered and dropped altitude. Through breaks in the fog, they spotted a frozen field near the village of Vught, close to Mechelin-sur-Meuse. Hohnmans tried to make an emergency landing, but the wheels caught on uneven ground. The plane skidded, spun, and came to rest in a plume of steam and snow. Both men survived. But the noise had drawn the attention of Belgian border guards stationed nearby. Realizing where they were, Rheinberger panicked. He tried to burn the documents, but the papers were damp from snow. The flames sputtered and died. Within minutes, Belgian soldiers arrived and arrested them. As the two Germans were taken into custody, the guards noticed the half-burned maps and files lying beside the wreck. What they had stumbled upon, purely by accident, were Hitler's own invasion plans for Western Europe. News of the capture raced through Belgian intelligence channels. The documents were rushed to Brussels, then to Paris, and within hours, Allied commanders were poring over maps that revealed the very heart of the German strategy. For Hitler, who prided himself on control and secrecy, this accident was more than an embarrassment, it was a catastrophe. And yet, in the strange logic of war, this disaster would not destroy his plans. It would transform them. By the evening of January 10, 1940, the Mechlin incident had exploded across Allied intelligence circles. In Brussels, Belgian officers could hardly believe their luck. They had captured 2 senior German officers, alive, and with them, a trove of partially burned documents stamped Geheime Kommandosache, top secret. When the charred pages were pieced together, they revealed movement orders, coordination tables, and communication codes, all pointing toward a German offensive through Belgium and the Netherlands. To the Belgians, this confirmed what they had long feared. Germany planned to violate their neutrality once again, just as it had in 1914. That night, copies of the documents were rushed to the French General Headquarters in Vincennes and shared with the British Expeditionary Force in northern France. Field Marshal Maurice Gamelin, commander of French forces, studied them closely. The documents appeared genuine. They showed a massive assault through central Belgium, driving toward Namur and Liège, precisely the route the Allies had prepared to counter. But not everyone was convinced. Some senior officers suspected a German deception. Could Hitler really have allowed invasion plans to fall into enemy hands? It seemed almost too convenient. Still, the Allies could not ignore the evidence. Belgian forces began quietly mobilizing defensive positions along the Albert Canal. French and British units were put on alert. For a brief moment, the Western Allies believed they had the upper hand, a rare advantage in a war that had so far gone entirely Germany's way. But inside Germany, the mood was very different. When word of the crash reached Berlin, panic rippled through the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, OKW, the German High Command. Major General Alfred Jodl, Hitler's operations chief, immediately dispatched agents to confirm the details. Within hours, the full scope of the disaster reached Hitler himself. The Führer was enraged. Witnesses described him pacing furiously inside the chancellery, his fists clenched, his voice echoing through the hallways. To lose an aircraft was one thing. To lose the invasion plans for the Western campaign was unthinkable. Hohnmans and Reinberger, both now prisoners, were branded as traitors and fools. A furious Hitler ordered that all existing copies of the Fallgelb plan be withdrawn and re-examined. For days, Germany's military machine froze. Meetings were cancelled, orders suspended. The trust between Hitler and his generals, already fragile, cracked further. Many officers feared Hitler would lash out unpredictably. But instead of abandoning the invasion entirely, he demanded something new. He wanted a plan that would strike with greater surprise, something the Allies could not predict, even with prior intelligence. This was the moment when General Erich von Manstein, a brilliant but often overlooked strategist, saw his chance. Manstein had long argued against the predictable thrust through central Belgium. He proposed a daring alternative, an attack through the Ardennes forest, a rugged and lightly defended region the Allies considered impassable for tanks. Before Mechlin, Hitler had dismissed the idea as too risky. But now, shaken by the loss of secrecy, he reconsidered. Manstein's concept promised both surprise and revenge. It would turn the Allies' expectations against them. In the weeks that followed, meetings between Manstein, Heinz Guderian, and von Rundstedt reshaped the entire plan. The new strategy, approved in February 1940, would see panzer divisions pour through the Ardennes, cross the Meuse River, and encircle Allied forces in Belgium, cutting them off from France. The Mechlin disaster had, paradoxically, saved Hitler's Western campaign from predictability and birthed the plan that would lead to the stunning German victory in May 1940. But that victory would come at a hidden cost. By shifting his faith toward bold, risky maneuvers and distrusting his generals even more, Hitler set a pattern that would later haunt Germany's war effort. What began as a navigational mistake had become a strategic turning point, a moment when chance, fear, and pride combined to rewrite the war's course. And as the snow melted over that quiet Belgian field, no one, Not even Hitler himself could have known that this single wrong turn had just placed the first crack in the foundation of his empire. The human angle, fear, duty, and the weight of a briefcase for Major Helmuth Rheinberger and Major Erich Hohnmans. The Mechelen incident was not born from betrayal or cowardice. It was the product of human fragility under the strain of war. Both men were experienced officers, loyal to their country, and bound by orders that demanded absolute secrecy. Rheinberger's briefcase held the lifeblood of Hitler's Western campaign. To him it was not paper, it was power, victory, and trust. Yet war often collapses under the smallest errors. In that fog over the Belgian border, confidence became confusion. When the Messerschmitt's engine failed and the white earth rose up beneath them, the two men's instincts split. One thought of survival, the other of the documents. Witnesses later recalled that after the crash, Rheinberger ran frantically across the snow, clutching the briefcase. He tore the pages, tried to ignite them, even attempted to chew and swallow fragments when the fire refused to burn. It was panic, not discipline, that guided him. Moments later, Belgian guards arrived with rifles raised, shouting orders he barely understood. The world would judge him harshly, but the truth was simpler. He was an officer caught between duty and instinct, trapped in a storm that neither gun nor rank could control. In the end, the Mechelen crash reminds us that wars are not fought only by machines and generals. They are fought by men, and men make mistakes. The tactical angle. When secrecy fails, strategy shifts from a tactical perspective. The Mechelen incident was catastrophic, a military planner's nightmare realized. The Fall-Gelb plan, as it existed in January 1940, relied on complete surprise. It aimed to overwhelm Belgian defenses and trap the Allied armies before they could reposition. Every phase, from air cover to armor movements, was timed within hours. When that plan fell into enemy hands even partially, the entire tactical structure collapsed. For the German command, it wasn't simply the loss of paper, it was the exposure of intent. Once the Allies knew where the attack would fall, the advantage of surprise vanished. The immediate reaction was paralysis. German officers debated whether to proceed with the same plan, assuming the Allies would dismiss the documents as a ruse, or to delay the invasion entirely. Hitler, fearing leaks and betrayal, ordered multiple postponements. Each delay forced divisions to remain in forward positions during one of the coldest winters in memory, draining morale and resources. Ironically, this enforced pause allowed Germany's armored forces to continue training, refining new blitzkrieg tactics that would later devastate France. It also gave von Manstein the time he needed to reshape the operational blueprint. So while Mechelen was a disaster in the moment, it became a pivot in German strategy, the event that destroyed an outdated plan and forced innovation. The enemy angle, the Allies' gift. They didn't trust enough to the Allies. The Mechelen document seemed like a miracle, but one wrapped in doubt. When Belgian intelligence delivered the briefcase to General Raoul van Overstraeten, the king's military advisor, his first words were cautious. This may be real, or it may be what they wish us to see. By January 13th, French and British intelligence officers in Paris were debating the same question. The documents looked authentic. Troop movements, Luftwaffe support grids, code numbers, all matched known German patterns. Yet the possibility of deception lingered. Field Marshal Gamelin, though concerned, did not overhaul his defense plan. He believed his existing deployment, the Dial Plan, which moved Allied armies into Belgium to block the Germans, was already sound. Even with the Mechelen intelligence, he saw no reason to alter it. Thus, the greatest irony of the Mechelen incident was that the Allies received a priceless warning, and still did not use it fully. When the real invasion came in May 1940, they moved their forces north into Belgium exactly as Hitler expected, leaving the Ardennes weakly guarded. The same briefcase that might have saved them instead lulled them into confirming their own expectations. It was proof not just of German risk but of Allied overconfidence. The Mechelen incident was not merely an accident. It was a mirror reflecting every side of human conflict: fear, misjudgment, pride, and chance. Yet even within this moment of confusion, the seeds of a new German strategy were beginning to take root. one that would soon burst from the forests of the Ardennes with devastating force. The leadership angle, Hitler's rage and the rise of Manstein. When the reports of the crash reached the Reich Chancellery, Hitler's reaction was volcanic. For hours, his staff heard shouting echo through the marble corridors. He demanded names, punishments, explanations. To him, secrecy was sacred, the lifeblood of blitzkrieg. The thought that two officers could hand the enemy his plans was an insult he could neither forgive nor forget. The Führer's instinct was not calm analysis but fury. He considered executing everyone connected to the incident. Yet beneath that rage, something else stirred, doubt. For the first time since the war began, Hitler realized how fragile his command truly was, how one accident could unravel his vision. This doubt transformed into obsession. He began micromanaging operational details, demanding new measures for document control and officer discipline. It also pushed him toward riskier ideas, anything to regain the sense of control he had lost in that Belgian field. Enter Erich von Manstein, the cerebral strategist who had long argued that the German plan was predictable. His proposal, to thrust through the Ardennes instead of central Belgium, had been repeatedly dismissed by the High Command. But now Hitler was desperate for something bold. The Mechelen disaster ironically opened the door for Manstein's genius. By late February 1940, Hitler summoned him to Berlin, listened carefully, and within days approved the plan. The leadership lesson was paradoxical. A mistake born of confusion had given rise to one of the most daring operational gambits in modern warfare, yet it also cemented a dangerous precedent. Hitler's growing belief that his intuition, not his generals, would determine victory, a belief that would lead him step by step to ruin. The moral angle, chance and the weight of consequence. Few events in war demonstrate the moral power of chance as starkly as Mechelen. No bomb fell, no shot was fired, and yet the trajectory of a world war shifted because two men misread a compass. This was not courage or villainy. It was chance elevated to historical force. Rheinberger and Hohnemans did not choose their role. They became instruments of fate. Their single mistake set off ripples that would affect millions. Soldiers marching to new fronts, civilians caught in future bombings, entire nations reshaped by the revised German strategy. Historians often debate whether individual errors can truly change the course of history. Mechelen stands as undeniable proof that they can. A random gust of wind, a navigational misjudgment, a failed fire, and the result was the re-engineering of an invasion plan that would soon alter Europe's map. The moral weight of this incident lies not in guilt or innocence, but in fragility. It shows how vast empires, built on steel and ideology, can be undone by the smallest human errors, and how those errors can paradoxically forge the path to even greater destruction. For Rheinberger, that truth became personal torment. While imprisoned in Belgium, he begged his captors to destroy the documents completely, warning them of the blood that would follow if they failed. He was right, though not in the way he imagined. The technological angle, the vulnerability of modern warfare. By 1940, Germany prided itself on its modern military machine, fast aircraft, encrypted communications, mobile divisions, and meticulous coordination. Yet the Mechelen incident exposed a fundamental weakness. Even the most advanced war depended on fragile human systems. The Bf-108 Typhoon that carried the plans was a sleek, modern aircraft, but it lacked basic navigational safeguards like a radio compass. Pilots relied on visual markers and mechanical instruments easily distorted by fog or magnetic interference. The decision to carry physical documents rather than transmit information electronically also reflected the limits of wartime technology. In an era when radio encryption was still unreliable, paper remained the backbone of command, and paper could burn, fall, or be captured. This vulnerability forced a rapid change in German military protocol. After Mechelen, the Luftwaffe banned the transport of operational plans by air. Sensitive documents were thereafter moved only by courier, under armed guard, and usually by land. But the larger technological lesson went deeper. It reminded all sides that machines did not make war infallible. Even in an age of speed and precision, the fate of nations still rested on the hand, and mistakes, of the people operating those machines. The Mechelin incident, viewed through these lenses, human, tactical, leadership, moral, and technological, becomes more than a simple accident. It is a study of how fragility, chance, and innovation collide in warfare. A wrong turn had forced Hitler to reinvent his Western offensive, empowering new minds and new methods. And as winter faded into spring, the consequences of that transformation were already in motion, waiting to erupt in one of the most shocking campaigns of the war. Spring 1940. The snows of the phony war had melted into rivers of mud along the German border. The Mechelin crash was now 3 months past, but its consequences were only beginning to surface. Inside the Wolfschanze, Hitler's headquarters, the atmosphere had changed. The Führer was no longer just impatient, he was inspired. The panic of January had become a dangerous kind of clarity. The Mechelin failure had confirmed what he already suspected. The old Prussian generals were too cautious, too bound by tradition. Hitler now championed a new vision, one that mirrored the theories of Erich von Manstein, Heinz Guderian, and a handful of reformist officers who believed that speed and surprise, not numbers and fortifications, would win the next war. On February 17, 1940, Manstein personally presented his modified plan to Hitler. His idea was audacious. Rather than storming central Belgium head-on, German panzer divisions would instead punch through the Ardennes forest, a region of steep hills, narrow roads, and dense trees that Allied planners had dismissed as impassable to tanks. Hitler's eyes lit up. For once, a plan matched his appetite for risk. He approved it almost immediately. In one meeting, the entire German strategy for EQ, conquering Western Europe, was rewritten. That decision, born directly from the fallout of Mechelin, would change the war more than any other single strategic shift. In the weeks that followed, Germany began a quiet transformation. Troop movements were disguised, bridges reinforced, and thousands of tanks, Panzer III and IVs, were redirected toward the Ardennes sector. Columns of men and machines rehearsed night marches under blackout conditions. Engineers practiced building pontoon bridges for the Meuse River crossings. The generals still had doubts. General von Rundstedt warned that a stalled advance in the Ardennes could trap their best armored forces in the forest, vulnerable to air attack. Halder, chief of staff, called it a gambit with no reserve, but Hitler silenced dissent with a single phrase: "The enemy believes it cannot be done. That is precisely why we will do it." By April, the plan was ready. Operation Fall Gelb was reborn, no longer a repeat of 1914, but something entirely new. It was now a strike designed to bypass the strongest Allied lines, to cut them off before they could even react. Meanwhile, the Allies waited, still fixated on Belgium's central plains. The documents captured at Mechelin had convinced them that the Germans would attack north again. Their armies were positioned accordingly. The British Expeditionary Force and France's best divisions clustered along the Dyle River line, ready to face the wrong enemy in the wrong place. In a sense, the Mechelin papers had trapped them in their own assumptions. Hitler's disaster had become his camouflage. On the night of May 9, 1940, the German army began to move. More than 3 million soldiers, 2,500 tanks, and 4,000 aircraft prepared to strike. From Norway to the Ardennes, the entire Western Front stirred to life. At 5:35 a.m., May 10th, the invasion began. German paratroopers stormed Fort Eben-Emael in Belgium, silencing the fortress in less than a day. To the north, the Luftwaffe bombed Dutch airfields and bridges, paralyzing their defenses. And to the south, in the misty valleys of the Ardennes, Guderian's armored columns advanced through terrain the Allies considered impossible. In narrow forest roads packed with tanks and trucks, engines roared through the darkness. Soldiers chopped down trees to widen the path, while engineers repaired bridges faster than reconnaissance aircraft could report them destroyed. The impassable forest had become a highway. By May 12th, the Germans reached the Meuse River near Sedan. The same river line that Allied intelligence once thought secure was now under threat by a force they had not expected, moving faster than any in modern history. In just 3 days, Hitler's army had accomplished what planners said could not be done. The Mechelin disaster, which once symbolized German incompetence, had evolved into the perfect illusion. an accident that convinced the enemy to look the other way, while the real blow gathered in the shadows. The moment of truth would come at Sedan, where Germany's armored spearhead prepared to cross the Meuse. If they succeeded, the entire Allied line in Belgium would collapse, and the road to France would open wide. But even then, in the quiet before the storm, few understood how much of that coming triumph had been born not from strategy, but from a wrong turn over a frozen Belgian field 4 months earlier. The dawn of May 13, 1940, rose red over the Meuse River. French artillery positions near Sedan and Dinant were quiet at first. The enemy, they believed, was still days away. Then the sound began, a deep rolling thunder that seemed to come from the very earth itself. It was the sound of tanks, hundreds of them, emerging from the misty forests of the Ardennes. Columns of panzers led by Heinz Guderian surged forward, engines roaring, tracks crushing the morning dew. German soldiers, their faces streaked with exhaust and mud, moved with mechanical precision. The French defenders were stunned. Their intelligence officers had insisted no major force could move through the Ardennes so quickly. Their maps showed the terrain as impassable for heavy armor. Yet now entire divisions of tanks stood at the riverbank, assembling pontoon bridges under enemy fire. At 7 a.m., the Luftwaffe struck. More than 1,000 Stuka dive bombers screamed down on French positions, obliterating trenches, bridges, and communication lines. The explosions echoed like thunderclaps through the valleys. For the first time, the full power of coordinated air-ground blitzkrieg unfolded in the west. By noon, Guderian's tanks began to cross the Meuse. The French artillery, disorganized and blinded by smoke, could not stop them. Soldiers fled their posts as Stukas tore apart the bunkers one by one. By nightfall, the German bridgehead was secure. That same evening, Hitler received the news in his headquarters. His eyes reportedly filled with tears. For him, it was not just victory, it was vindication. The disaster of Mechelen had been redeemed. His gamble through the Ardennes, born out of humiliation and anger, had succeeded beyond anyone's expectation. In less than a week, the entire Western Front began to unravel. As the Panzer Corps fanned out from Sedan, they sliced deep into the French rear. The Allied forces, still moving north into Belgium, realized too late that they were being encircled. By May 20th, German tanks reached the English Channel near Abbeville, just 10 days after the offensive began. It was an operational masterpiece. The Allies' best divisions were trapped between the Germans and the sea, cut off from supplies, communication, and retreat. The British Expeditionary Force and the northern French armies were forced back to the port of Dunkirk, where they made their desperate evacuation under constant bombardment. Nearly 340,000 soldiers escaped, but left behind their weapons, vehicles, and morale. To the world, it looked like an unstoppable German triumph. To Hitler, it was proof that destiny favored his will. And yet beneath that surface of victory, the Mechelen shadow lingered. The wrong turn that had once humiliated the Reich had reshaped the way Hitler thought, and that change would come to define his downfall. He had learned the wrong lesson. Where Manstein saw the Ardennes plan as a flexible, calculated risk, Hitler saw it as confirmation of his own genius. He began to believe that intuition alone could outmatch the expertise of his generals. In the following months, he dismissed dissenting officers, distrusted advisors, and took direct control of strategic planning. The man who once feared losing control now demanded total command. This shift, the psychological aftermath of Mechelen, planted the seeds of disaster for the campaigns to come. The overextension in the Soviet Union, the refusal to retreat at Stalingrad, the stubborn defense of Normandy. Each of those later failures carried within them the echo of that first accident. The moment when Hitler realized that chance could be turned into power, and mistook luck for destiny. When historians later traced the chain of events, they could follow it backward, from the fall of France, to the Blitz over Britain, to the invasion of the Soviet Union, all the way back to that January morning over Belgium, a single navigation error, a fog-bound flight, a briefcase that refused to burn. From that spark, the course of the Second World War bent and twisted, producing triumph, tragedy, and ultimately collapse. Hitler's empire would rise upon the illusion of control and crumble beneath the weight of the very arrogance that Mechelen had set in motion. By summer 1940, German flags flew over Paris. Hitler stood before the Eiffel Tower, silent, triumphant, unaware that his greatest victory had been built on the foundation of a mistake, a wrong road taken in the fog, months before the first shot was fired in France. That moment of glory, born from confusion, would one day come full circle, because the arrogance it created, the belief that fate itself bent to his will, would drive him to the Eastern Front, and toward the ruin that began in Mechelin. By the end of June 1940, Europe had changed beyond recognition. The once unshakable French army, believed to be the strongest in Europe, had surrendered. The British stood alone across the Channel, hastily rebuilding their defenses. And Adolf Hitler, the man who just months before had been humiliated by a crashed courier plane in Belgium, now ruled the continent from the Pyrenees to the Baltic. But beneath that surface of triumph, the Mechelin incident still lingered in quiet conversations among officers and intelligence circles. It was remembered not for its failure, but for what it accidentally caused. When Major Rheinberger's briefcase fell into Belgian hands in January 1940, it seemed to spell disaster for the Reich. In those papers lay the entire operational plan for the invasion of the West, the routes of attack, the timing, the composition of divisions, everything. The Belgian military rushed the documents to Brussels, and soon they were in the hands of French and British intelligence. For the Allies, it seemed like a godsend, proof that Hitler planned to strike through northern Belgium and Holland, repeating the same pattern as in 1914. But here lay the cruel irony. The more they studied the stolen plans, the more they trusted them. The Allies assumed the Germans would not change their course now that their secret was out, believing that even if the documents were compromised, the invasion through Belgium was inevitable. They prepared exactly for that. They strengthened their northern defenses and committed their best armies to the Belgian frontier, precisely where Hitler wanted them to go after his new plan was forged. It was a trap born from a mistake, and it worked to perfection. Inside the German command, however, the psychological shock of Mechelin never fully faded. Rheinberger's failure had led to an internal investigation, one that rattled the confidence of several intelligence units. The Abwehr, already distrusted by Hitler, came under increasing scrutiny. This atmosphere of paranoia pushed the Nazi war machine toward ever greater centralization, the seeds of the command structure that would later suffocate strategic flexibility. Meanwhile, Erich Honemanns, the pilot, faced a quieter fate. He survived the crash, was captured briefly by Belgian authorities, and was later repatriated after the German victory in 1940. Yet his career never recovered. He was viewed with suspicion by his peers, a man whose navigation error had nearly ruined Hitler's plans, even though it had, paradoxically, paved the way for success. For Rheinberger, the story ended in shame. He tried to destroy the documents before capture, setting the briefcase on fire. But Belgian soldiers extinguished the flames before they consumed the most crucial pages. After Germany's victory, he was hailed quietly for his loyalty, but never again trusted with critical intelligence. He faded into bureaucratic obscurity, his name remembered only by historians tracing the threads of chance. In the British War Cabinet, the Mechelin incident was studied with disbelief. Reports from MI6 and the French Deuxième Bureau noted that the Germans had somehow turned an intelligence disaster into a strategic masterpiece. It became an early case study in the dangers of predictability, the failure to adapt when the enemy changes direction. Churchill himself, years later, would describe the German breakthrough through the Ardennes as a blow delivered against the mind as well as the line. He knew that the Allies' rigid thinking, reinforced by those captured plans, and had allowed the Germans to turn a mistake into a weapon, and so, as the summer of 1940 burned on and London braced for bombardment, the quiet memory of Mechelin-sur-Meuse faded into the background. But for those who had witnessed it firsthand, Belgian farmers, captured pilots, frightened soldiers, the crash had marked a strange, almost supernatural moment. It was as if fate itself had stumbled just for an instant, and from that stumble emerged the most devastating campaign of modern history. The briefcase that refused to burn had altered the destiny of nations. By the close of 1940, the accident at Mechelin had all but disappeared from wartime headlines. The world now spoke of Dunkirk, Paris, and the Battle of Britain, the grand chapters of a war that was rapidly escalating. Yet within military archives and quiet intelligence circles, Mechlin remained a haunting case study, a moment when pure chance redirected the largest military campaign in modern history. For the Allies, its lessons were bitter. British and French intelligence had possessed what many called the keys to Hitler's mind. And yet, through overconfidence, they failed to see how quickly that mind could adapt. The French High Command, still wedded to the doctrines of the Great War, built its plans around static defense, around fixed lines and expected thrusts. They did not anticipate improvisation, and they underestimated audacity. The captured documents had told them what Hitler intended. They could not tell them what he would decide. In Germany, the incident produced a very different legacy. Within the OKH Army High Command, officers quietly debated the chain of events. Some saw Mechlin as a blessing, a moment that forced the Wehrmacht to abandon its outdated doctrine and embrace modern maneuver warfare. Others viewed it as proof that luck, not skill, had guided Hitler's rise. But in the dictator's mind there was no doubt. He had triumphed because destiny had chosen him. The belief hardened into ideology. He began to see himself not as a strategist surrounded by experts, but as the sole possessor of military instinct, a man whose intuition could outthink entire staffs of generals. This psychological shift, historians later noted, was the hidden consequence of the Mechlin crash. The event that should have humbled Hitler had instead convinced him that luck and will were proof of superiority. From then on, his relationship with his generals began to fracture. Dissent became disloyalty. Logic became defiance. It was a small fracture in 1940, but by 1943, it would split the German command apart. In post-war years, Allied analysts re-examined the chain of cause and effect. The U.S. Army's Historical Division, studying the European campaign, traced the origin of several German operational doctrines back to the lessons of Mechlin: the rapid adaptation, the bold gamble through the Ardennes, and the use of deception to exploit Allied expectations. All were responses to that January blunder. In short, the wrong turn had forced the Germans to become more flexible, while the Allies became more rigid. It was one of the cruel paradoxes of the Second World War, that the side which stumbled first learned fastest. Decades later, the crash site near Vught was reclaimed by time. The field where the Messerschmitt had come down was once again farmland. The burned outline of the briefcase was long gone, buried under layers of soil. Only local villagers remembered the day 2 German officers fell from the sky, nervous, shivering and begging to destroy their papers before capture. In Belgian military museums, fragments of the aircraft and copies of the seized documents are still preserved. Silent relics of a moment when fate, fog, and fear collided. To historians, the Mechlin incident became more than just a curiosity. It became a reminder of war's unpredictability, how one small accident could tilt the balance of continents. In the end, the mistake that gave birth to victory also planted the seed of defeat. For every success Hitler achieved after Mechlin, France, Norway, the Balkans, his belief in his own invincibility grew, and that arrogance led him eastward, into the vastness of the Soviet Union, where no amount of willpower could overcome the winter, the distance or the industrial might of his enemies. Thus, when Berlin finally fell in May 1945, the echoes of Mechlin returned full circle. The chain of decisions that began with a wrong turn in the fog ended with an empire in ruins. The same arrogance that had turned a blunder into a triumph had also turned a triumph into catastrophe. History often remembers great wars through battles, through the roar of guns and the fall of cities. But sometimes it turns on a quieter moment, a wrong turn, a clouded sky, a single man's mistake. The Mechlin incident was one of those moments, small in appearance, enormous in consequence. It began as a failure, a plane crash, a captured briefcase, 2 frightened officers. Yet from that failure emerged the blueprint of the entire Western campaign. Had the fog not drifted that day, Hitler's armies might have struck the Low Countries head-on, repeating the static bloodbath of 1914. Instead, forced to rethink, they struck through the Ardennes. and changed modern warfare forever. But the true weight of Mechelin lies not in tactics, but in psychology. It shaped the mind of a dictator. Hitler came to believe that destiny was on his side, that luck itself obeyed his will. That illusion, born from a pilot's mistake, would harden into delusion. And from that delusion came the disasters of Stalingrad, Kursk, and the collapse of Berlin. So when historians say Hitler's defeat began here, they are not speaking only of maps and maneuvers. They mean that his downfall began the moment he'd learned the wrong lesson from success, the moment chance turned to arrogance, and arrogance became his compass. In the end, the crash near Mechelin was more than an accident. It was a mirror, reflecting both the brilliance and the blindness of a man who mistook fortune for genius. And in that field of frost and fog, where a briefcase once refused to burn, the first ember of Nazi Germany's eventual ruin was lit. The war that reshaped the world began to turn against itself on the day one pilot lost his way through enemy roads.